the Trump people basically live in a transactional world where they don't understand why Ukraine would resist because they don't really understand about sovereignty. Like they just fundamentally don't get it. And so Europe, including Britain, is now left in a position where you're choosing a future where either you're dealing with a world in which, Kiev is important, or you're dealing with a world where Moscow is important. And that's a strategic. No one is going to walk into the White House and change Trump's mind about Putin.
Well, joining me now is Timothy Snyder. He is the Director of Public History Laboratory and Professor of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Previously, he was the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University until his move to Canada. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Glad to be with you.
Now, you have said that history is noticing something that we aren't seeing, that we haven't seen. What are we not seeing about Donald Trump's America at the moment?
I think the underlying issue would be the issue of sovereignty, that the modern state is based not just on its own capacities to do things, but on practices and traditions and laws that allow us to all feel like we're doing something together. I don't think the Trump administration understands sovereignty, either of other countries or of its own. And I think that in a way is a key to understanding why it is that they're breaking so much, because they don't really know what it is that they're breaking.
What do you mean in terms of respecting, let's talk about the US internally for the time being, respecting sovereignty there?
Yeah, that is the central way to begin, because, they don't understand why Canadians want to have Canada or why Ukrainians want to have Ukraine, but they don't really understand why Americans want to have America. From their point of view, the United States is just a grift. It's just something, patriotism is just something that they use. And so their weakness is that they don't actually get how the rule of law functions. They don't actually get that people might take risks or care about the country. And so since they think it's just a grift, they think it's just a kind of play, they can weaken things in a way that they themselves don't really understand past a point of no return.
So when Donald Trump's movement say they want to make America great again, MAGA, what is the vision of America that you think they have? Or do you think they actually don't have a vision?
I think their vision, of the Trump family, the vision I think would be like Russia in 1993. Like it's a dysfunctional state and a few people who don't even particularly have any business acumen are able to pick up the pieces and become rich. I think that's their vision. The great again is this sort of normal nostalgic play that you always get from the far right in the 21st century. What it does is that it tells you that you're the real people and that other people aren't. It tells you that you're always innocent, you always did good things. And relevant to the point that we're making here, it puts the state aside completely. There is no state. It's just the right people against the wrong people. And no one is asking the government to actually do anything for anyone.
And when you say right and wrong, that's not a moral judgment, is it?
I'm not sure when I said right and wrong, but the Make America Great Again business assumes that you, the actual folk, the actual people, are always right because you're always innocent, regardless of what you do. And that's a crucial thing. Like you're no longer to be judged by any kind of moral or legal criteria or patriotic criteria. You're to be judged by the appearance of belonging to the actual people as opposed to the bad guys. And Trump is excellent at that. He's excellent at the appearances, at defining who's in and who's out. That's what he's good at.
Is Donald Trump the driver of this, or is he just riding something?
That's a great question. I think he's it's a driverless automobile, and he's sort of jumped on. He's the guy who knows how to have fun, So he's not just a passenger, but he didn't create the vehicle. The vehicle involves huge wealth inequality, internet disinformation, and a lack of social mobility. He's not just riding along, though. He is processing and using all of those things. The lack of social mobility means that people like a hustler who cheats. The disinformation means that people like someone who can appeal to their immediate emotions and give them that quick dopamine hit. The wealth inequality business means that people are looking for a way to get around the whole system and want to identify with someone who's apparently wealthy. So he didn't create these conditions, but he's also not just being moved along with them, like some flotsam or jetsam. He's adapted them, and he's also made them all worse.
Yeah, he did win two elections, once in the Electoral College and the second time in the Electoral College and in the popular vote.
Sure.
Why?
Well, people have to take responsibility, right? I mean, I think one of the weaknesses of our commentary on this whole thing is that we imagine that it's all about the candidate. I mean, the forces that we're describing also work on human beings. He exemplifies something that's appealing for reasons, and so there are deep problems which one can only address with government tools. But also, people have to take responsibility for who they vote for and for the good or bad reasons for having done so. So the why has to do with the problems, with the disinformation, with the wealth inequality, but it also has to do with people taking responsibility for trying to address those problems. So I mean, we can't just blame him. We have to also blame ourselves.
But I mean, this is an issue we've clearly had it here with our vote on the European Union as to why a majority would vote to give away rights.
Or why would you vote to give away your children's future, your grandchildren's future? Or why would you vote to be poorer rather than richer? Why would you vote to be less powerful rather than more powerful? All of which have been the consequences of this. I mean, and then people. I mean, you can correct me, but if people were to make that decision today, they would probably make it a different way. And I think it has to do with the way that politics. And 2016 was a great example of this, both in Brexit and the election of Trump, where the future goes away, right? The people who are contesting things make the future go away, and they make everything about a momentary us and them, right? So a lot of the voting about Brexit was about some kind of spectacle of immigration. And the same was true for Trump. A lot of his victory has to do with the ability to conjure up a spectacle of us and them, which is not really directly relevant to the issue concerned. It's Trump deporting, people in a more spectacular fashion, or pictures of immigrants on the sides of buses or whatever. That doesn't really change people's lives. It doesn't even really change immigration, but it reduces a long-term issue to a kind of short-term us and them, who's in, who's out type issue. So that's a lesson we should probably learn, right? Because the fact that both Brexit and Trump happened in 2016 was axial. Because once those things happen, then it becomes harder to undo them. I mean, you can explain better than me why it is that Britain can't just undo Brexit. It seems to me there's some kind of awkwardness about directly naming something as a mistake. I'm not sure, but it's hard. That's easier than the problem of just trying to undo Trump, because Trump is a human who keeps walking through the room and making a mess.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, whether or not people would reverse the Brexit referendum, I mean, I've got your book on tyranny here. You wrote after the first Trump victory, but the American people went in even stronger a second time.
Well, he got, I don't want to dispute that he won, right? He did win, but he only got 49.5%, which is not a historically huge electoral margin. It's one of the smallest in history, and with not particularly high turnout. But yeah, I mean, they went in a second time, but I think the reason that he won fundamentally has to do with the anti-incumbent wave of 2024, where Trump was in the luxurious position that even though he had been president before, he got to run as the challenger because Harris was identified as the incumbent, and people were unhappy with the status quo. And I think there's another ironic thing here, which is that the Biden administration was basically successful in cleaning up Trump's mess. And when your mess has been cleaned up, then you think about making another one. You don't make a mess. So I think Trump kind of lucked out. But yeah, again, to repeat my point earlier, Americans have to take responsibility for the fact that we can't remember anything for longer than 5 seconds. That's our problem. And people are now remembering the reasons they didn't like Trump the first time around, but it's on us to remember that in the election season and not 6 months later.
Now, you're a historian. You've made it very clear that history doesn't repeat itself exactly. But do you see parallels with what's happening with the Trump administration, what has happened elsewhere in Europe over the last couple of centuries or so?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the reason why I don't like the history repeats itself cliche is not so much that it's not precise, it's that It's the way it takes away responsibility. Because if history is a thing that's out there repeating itself like a poem, then we're not responsible. And of course, one of the fundamental things that distinguishes history from some of the social sciences, at least as they're more brutally practiced, is that we take human agency and human responsibility and human subjectivity into the picture. So history doesn't repeat itself because we're part of history and we're not predictable. We can do various things. Sorry for the tangent, but it's important. As far as like things being recognizable, right? That's the key thing. What we have is history in the sense that we can look back at Germany 1930s, for example, or the American South in the 1880s, for example, and say things worked that way once, so that means that was possible. Something like that might also be possible. Or we can say, in general, if you attack reporters and clear the horizon of local factuality, that opens the space for a spectacle of fascism. You can notice things that, or you can say, globalization since the 1880s has been handled either as a challenge or as a conspiracy. And we know which way it goes if it's handled as a conspiracy. So you can pull things from the past which allow you to see the present more clearly, and then enable you to act in the future. If you don't have the past, imperfect as it is as a guide, then everything that happens in the present seems like a surprise, and then the surprise becomes the excuse not to do anything.
In the United States, it's quite clear that the administration is challenging the other traditional checks and balances, that it's intimidated the Congress, where it also has a majority. It's challenging the judicial system. It's challenging the media. Do you think those institutions are strong enough in the United States to fight back?
Yeah, to fight back for sure. I like the way you ask it, to fight back for sure. Because what I don't like are the guardrails metaphors. Like, I don't like the idea that there's like some kind of fixed physical barrier, like a guardrail, because there isn't. All those institutions. I also appreciate your mentioning civil society, because there's a set of checks and balances that are in the Constitution, and then there's the de facto checks, like, are people willing to protest? Are professional organizations willing to show solidarity? Do universities cooperate with one another, or do they let themselves be picked off one by one? Do we like it when people are deported, or do we rally against it? So you have two different kinds of checks, and yes, they are strong enough to fight back. They won't automatically win, but nor will they automatically lose. And the crucial thing is to buy time, take their momentum away, take the small victories that you can, laugh at them along the way, and show that you're in the room, like show your presence. Be there, even though you don't know when you're going to win and when you're going to lose. Be there and try, and don't let them have the sense that everything is inevitable.
And do you see a Democratic Party which could win the next election?
Those things are connected. So technically, like the political scientists say, we're in a situation of competitive authoritarianism where the incumbent now has structural advantages having to do with physical intimidation, having to do with lack of inequality in media access, having to do with unequal access to the polls when election day comes. There are built-in structural advantages to the incumbent and his party right now, which doesn't mean that you can't win. But the way that you win is by recognizing that you're in a situation where you need social engagement and you need unusual coalitions to form. And that can happen. It can be done. But what I'm trying to say is that it's not the Democratic Party against the Republican Party. It's the Democratic Party as part of a larger coalition, which it has to learn how to make as well. So like the protest part in your last question, the civil society part in your last question, has to reach out and make contact with the Democrats, and the Democrats have to make contact with it as well for this to turn around.
We should make clear that you have made it very clear that the reason why you've left the United States, left Yale for Toronto, is not in that sense running away from the Trump administration in any sense. You were already doing it. Nonetheless, do you feel personally intimidated or threatened at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, just to be absolutely clear about this, I left the United States during the Biden administration, which I wasn't afraid of. And I'm also not afraid of the Trump administration. I spent a lot of time in the last year inside the United States and crossing that border. Also, a lot of time in the last year in Ukraine. But I don't. It's not. Do I feel personally intimidated? Absolutely not. I do not feel personally intimidated. I feel like myself, and I should be saying the things that I ought to be. I ought to be saying. I'm much less at risk. I mean, it's a very. Like, I get to be on Times Radio talking about this stuff. The people who are actually at risk in the U.S. are people who are undocumented, people who are of color. Women are much more prone, are much more vulnerable than men on social media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, like, there are things that happen to me that are not desirable, but I don't feel intimidated, and certainly there are people who are much greater risk than I am. The crucial thing in politics, I mean, this is like the last lesson on tyranny, my little book, is that you have to be as courageous as you can. And that's going to be different for different people. But if we all lean in a tiny bit, that's probably going to be enough.
But you don't think, for example, you're at the point where at the border, Homeland Security may say, Timothy Snyder, you can't come in?
Oh, that could happen. But your question was whether I'm intimidated by it. And the answer to that is no.
But you really think that's an active possibility that as an American?
Oh, of course. Yeah. No, I mean, it'd be, I'm not saying that I think it's going to happen the next time I cross the border, but and I should say that thus far, nothing like that, nothing of that sort that you're precisely naming has happened, and I hope it doesn't. But those sorts of things do happen, right? That is the kind of thing that could happen. Different agents in our Department of Homeland Security have behaved in different ways towards different kinds of people, and they're pushing the border. They're pushing the border on what's normal. So I think it's important to name those scenarios and to recognize that they're possible. They're certainly possible. Yeah.
Again, looking at historic parallels, how do you think other countries should react to this? I mean, for example, the UK appears to have decided and said, well, there's still a special relationship. America's our closest ally. We can work with Trump and Hegseth and J.D. Vance. Do you think that's the appropriate reaction for a country which regards itself as a fellow leading Western democracy?
Well, the interesting thing about the phrase special relationship is that relationships can be special in various ways. I mean, we've all had special relationships, but they're not necessarily all positive. I think that, look, the English language and certain bizarre stereotypes about England that people in the Trump administration have, and their monarchism, may give you an edge. Like like some of them are actual monarchists. They haven't thought the thing through, but that, like their sort of storybook idea of the way that England works, where a king wakes up in the morning and has crumpets and tells everyone what to do, like that's how they want to live, so their ridiculous ideas about England may give you some kind of in, but I wouldn't push it any further than that. And when one is serious about this, what one is really talking about is an American government that believes that the far right should be in power in all European countries. And that's where our policy is directed, right? When they talk about free speech, what they mean is our oligarchical social media platforms should set the parameters of conversation in your countries. And when they talk about free speech, what they mean is we believe that in the correct conditions, i.e. all our oligarchical social media platforms control your conversations, in those correct conditions, which we're going to call free speech, the far right will always win. And we believe that the far right should always win. That's what they think about England. That's what they think about Britain, I should say. That's what they think about all of Europe. And so that's what you're confronting, and you shouldn't have any illusions about that. The second thing, which is directly relevant, is Ukraine. The Trump people basically live in a transactional world where they don't understand why Ukraine would resist, because they don't really understand about sovereignty. Like they just fundamentally don't get it. And so Europe, including Britain, is now left in a position where you're choosing a future where either you're dealing with a world in which Kiev is important, or you're dealing with a world where Moscow is important. And that's a strategic. No one is going to walk into the White House and change Trump's mind about Putin. I don't believe. It's worth trying. I understand why people try. But fundamentally, Trump admires Putin and wants to be like Putin. He wants to be like Putin even more than he wants to be like a king. And so you can't really fundamentally change that by way of charm or a special relationship. You have to react to it by making sure that whatever Trump is saying on a given day about Ukraine or Russia that there's a consistent European, including consistent British policy to make sure that Ukraine cannot be defeated in this war.
Now, you have personally been very, very supportive of Ukraine. You've had fundraisers assisting Ukrainian defence. You spoke there, as has your wife. Do you still feel that it is possible for Ukraine to prevail as an independent sovereign nation?
Oh, well, yes. Very, I mean, if that's the standard, yes, of course. Of course, Ukraine can prevail as an independent sovereign nation. I mean, they've fought this war. I mean, if this were, if we were counting in the Second World War, right? We're from the Battle of Britain close to the end at this point. They fought this war for a long time on their own territory, taking horrible losses, but perhaps more importantly, innovating to the point where they're the ones, not us, although it's hard for us to accept it, us Anglo-Saxons, they're the ones, not us, who are learning how modern wars are actually fought, and they would be teaching it too if we would pay attention. So the thing they just did inside Russian territory, destroying Russian bombers, that was them. That was fundamentally them, and they are mechanizing the war increasingly so that fewer and fewer of their people have to be put at risk. So they can, I think, hold on for quite a while with the support of Britain and Europe. I'm not saying they can easily take all their territory back. What I do think is that wars are fundamentally political, as Clausewitz says, and it's not a matter of driving every Russian soldier off Ukrainian territory. It's a matter of whether the Russian political system can keep this up indefinitely, which I don't think they can. I mean, I think the Afghan war and various Russian systems have lost various important wars. In fact, most of them. It's a myth that Russia always loses wars. They lost, as you guys know, they lost in Crimea. They lost the Russo-Japanese War. They lost the First World War, or they had a revolution. They would have lost the second one if not for the Americans. They lost the Afghan War. They lost the First Chechen War. They can lose, and it's not going to be pretty when they do. But the only way for this to end is for enough of us in the West and around the world to show enough solidarity with the Ukrainians so that somebody in Russia realizes, whether it's Putin or someone else, that keeping this up is not the best way to keep the Russian system going.
I mean, can that be done without the United States if President Trump makes it clear that basically he's sympathetic to President Putin? I mean, after all, after his phone call yesterday, he said effectively that, he seemed to respect Russia's right to strike back against Operation Spider's Web.
Yeah, which is, of course, I mean, we should just say it's absolutely grotesque. Those Russian bombers have been killing Ukrainians for more than 3 years and 3 months. The idea that Ukraine striking Russian bombers is something that was justifies retaliation, like the idea that the war started the moment that Ukraine destroyed a Russian bomber. It's just ridiculous how, I mean, not just how immoral, but how unstrategic the White House is. That they're not capable of the kind of, they don't have the attention span. I mean, even if they had the intent, they don't have the attention span to follow a war, let alone prosecute one, which if I were an ally, I would be concerned about, frankly. They lack the attention span for this kind of thing, and they don't understand why Russia or Ukraine is fighting. They don't have any political intuition about what motivates countries to fight wars either, which again, as an ally, I would be concerned by that. But my answer to your question is yes. And in a way, this is good for Europe, including Britain, because this is a challenge which Europeans can meet. Your economies are much bigger than the Russian economy. You haven't done the things that you should have done 3 years ago in terms of the manufacture of munitions, for example. But there are but you do have the capacity to meet Russia on your own. You always have. And Ukraine has basically given you the chance by resisting, right? If the Ukrainians don't resist, then if the Ukrainians don't resist and the Americans have Trump, you are in a very dark world. But the Ukrainians resisting gives you the chance, the time to rally round someone who's doing the actual dirty work, or the hard work, I should say. Gives you the chance to rally around them and to build a Europe which, with or without the Americans, can be robust.
I mean, I asked that question because the first person who told me that I should read your book, Bloodlands, for example, was a French historian who said, well, it just shows that these lands are always going to be fought over and that they can never, ever be secure about their future. Or indeed, senior British military personnel who've said to me, well, in the end, Ukraine's not a strategic priority for us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to engage with like the particular, anonymous people who are in this question, but the way I see it is something like this: that Ukraine has been far more than we recognize at the center of the conflicts, which do turn out to be important for the British. So, I mean, the Second World War does seem to loom large in your imagination. And the Second World War was about Ukraine. It wasn't about, I mean, the only reason there was a Battle of Britain was to get you out of the way so that the Germans could invade Ukraine and control the foodstuffs and the other resources. You were secondary from Hitler's point of view. Hitler hoped you wouldn't fight, and when you did, he just wanted you out of the way. You were secondary. Ukraine was primary. And that's true for Putin in a different way as well. Like the way to break up Europe as a normal way of doing things is to take Ukraine, is to show that empire is still possible, is to show that you can still take resources in this way. It's to show that fascist nostalgia can still triumph over rationalism and progress and democracy. So Ukraine, I mean, we can decide that we don't think it's important, right? We can make that subjective choice, but it's a faraway country of which we have all learned more than we thought we were going to learn, and which matters a great deal to us. We can just, whether we believe it or not, it still does. Like you're kind enough to remember that I'm a historian. That if one is going to be a historian of the military, of strategy, over and over again, it turns out that Ukraine is what matters. And I would have thought that even before 2022, the practical lesson would have been, if you can secure Ukraine, you are then securing a Europe in which we're all going to have a lot more freedom of maneuver in the future. If you can't secure Ukraine, then you're dealing with Russian imperialism and all of that historical instability. So I would have put it in a positive way that the independence of Ukraine in 1991 was a kind of historic chance, just as the resistance of Ukraine in 2022 is a kind of historic chance to secure a peace which hasn't been secured for a very long time.
Viewing sort of geopolitics even more broadly, with the Trump administration and the successive American administrations saying that, Europe can look after itself, they want to turn towards China and the Pacific. Is there something, do you think, structurally in human politics around the world, which means that the transatlantic alliance is enduring, will always endure?
Well, I'd like to think we would come back to it. I mean, as I understand the Trump approach, it has to do with draining power from the overall system. It doesn't have to do with a particular preference for anyone over anyone else. It has to do with the idea that people like us, i.e. personally people like us, not the American state, but people like Trump, people like, oligarchs, tech bros, will do better in a world in which the state is less functional. They'll do better in a world where there's less political power and more oligarchical power. And so all of, when we work against the transatlantic alliance, what we're doing is making ourselves weaker. We're not making ourselves stronger. We're much stronger when we have allies, and we're much stronger when we're predictable with those allies. So the American policy, as I understand it, is to make the United States weaker, and to drain overall power from the system. And when you drain that power, Russia ends up being comparatively stronger, not because it got stronger, but because like a rock emerging from a drained lake or something. It's just always been there. And the same is true for China. The whole narrative about how China was inevitably going to catch up to the United States basically broke during the Biden administration. And now it's back. Now the Chinese could catch up to us because we're doing all the things actively to make ourselves less powerful, not just with our alliances, but with the self-destruction of American science, which may be the single most important geopolitical factor right now. This self-destruction of American science, which is what allowed us to become who we were geopolitically since 1941. So I don't think there's anything inherent about the transatlantic alliance. The American culture has drifted away from Europe. The lack of an American welfare state has made us less like Canada and less like Europe than we were 50 years ago. It's made us less patient, more short-lived, much more keen on immediate pleasures and so on, less capable of thinking in the long run. We've become more different because of that reason as well. I do think, though, that a transatlantic alliance is in everybody's interest and is possible, and is a very good thing. But I don't think I don't think there's any larger historical force, unfortunately, which makes it necessary.
And as someone who knows Europe very well, speaks many European languages other than English, how infectious do you think Trumpism is?
Trump is. I mean, look, Trump is Trump is a very talented politician. He doesn't care about his own country and its interests and has no conception of those things. But if you're trying to come to power in a world where everything happens quickly and most of what happens never happened, Trump is a good role model. He shows how it can be done. And so I don't, there's no, I don't think America is infectious under Trump. Very few people look at America and say, "Oh, well, we'd like to be more like America is under Trump than it was under Biden." But I think Trump is a role model for people. Yes, I think he's a role model for Nawrocki in Poland, and I think also, to turn it around a little bit, the one thing which gets missed is that the Trump people learn from other countries. They learn from Orban. They learn from Poland, like not Trump personally, but the people around him. CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee, which just had a meeting in Poland and which has invited Hungarians, right? They learn from other authoritarians, not because they're trying to make a better country, but because they're looking for tactics to get a certain kind of strongman in power indefinitely.
And finally, historians don't predict the future, quite rightly. But are you optimistic or pessimistic?
So optimism and pessimism are ways of seeing things. I'm more of a hope, not hope person. I think that democracy is about unpredictable people creating unpredictable futures by making coalitions which they may not have anticipated on the basis of ideas that they may not have known they were going to have. I don't think we get out of this by seeing things as being dark or light. I think we get out of this by seeing the islands we can hop to, and the people we can hop to with them. And so it's in that I'm hopeful, right? I'm hopeful. I see there are many things are. Historians aren't supposed to predict the future. I should plead guilty to having done it a few times. But what historians do see, I think it's fair to say, all of us, is that there's a very broad spectrum of possibility that exceeds the things that we can see in any given moment. And a lot of that is dark, but some of it's bright, and some of the good possibilities we don't see. And so working to see the things which are actually out there is one way of describing what hope is. So I would say I'm a hopeful person.
Timothy Snyder, thank you very much indeed.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.